my father formally stated on paper I wasn't his son. I used those very documents when he sued me for support. My name is Ethan. I'm 34 years old, a biotech researcher living in Boston. And until just last month, I honestly believed the file on my childhood was finally closed. I thought the ink had dried on those old wounds, the scars faded enough for me to simply forget them. I was wrong. So incredibly wrong. The past, you see, doesn't actually die. It just patiently waits for you to make enough money to be truly worth haunting. I was sitting in my lab, waiting for a centrifuge to spin down when security called. A process server was in the lobby, asking for me by name. I figured, great, another subpoena. Probably some patent dispute or another. It's just a hazard of the trade in biotech. Pharmaceutical companies are constantly suing each other over intellectual property, and sometimes, us researchers get dragged in as witnesses. But when I walked down to the lobby and opened that thick manila envelope, I didn't see corporate letterhead. Nothing about patents, research, or any of the professional headaches I'd grown accustomed to handling. Instead, I saw the imposing seal of the Connecticut Superior Court. My father, Gerald, the very man who had publicly and legally disowned me when I was 24 years old, was filing a petition under the state's filial responsibility statutes. He was claiming indigence. He cited a string of spectacularly failed venture capital investments, rapidly deteriorating health, and mounting medical bills. And he was demanding that I, his biological son, pay for his assisted living facility and provide a monthly stipend to cover all his expenses. To understand the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this lawsuit, you really have to understand our history. You have to understand who Gerald truly was. Gerald wasn't a father. He was a portfolio manager. And I was simply an underperforming asset in his ledger. I grew up in Darien, Connecticut, in a house that felt less like a warm home and far more like a pristine museum, where I was the only clumsy tourist. Everything was absolutely pristine. Everything was obscenely expensive. Everything was meant to impress visitors, never to make a child feel comfortable or genuinely loved. The furniture was the kind you absolutely weren't supposed to sit on. The artwork was the kind you absolutely weren't supposed to touch. And my father? He was the kind of man you were simply not allowed to disappoint. My mother died when I was 6. Cancer. It happened so fast that I barely had time to understand what was even happening before she was just gone. One month, she was reading me bedtime stories, making me hot chocolate on cold mornings. The very next month, I was wearing a tiny black suit at her funeral, utterly confused about why everyone was crying, and why my mother was sleeping in a box that they were putting into the ground. I remember the day they told me she wasn't coming home from the hospital. Gerald sat me down in his study, the exact same room where he would later blackmail me out of my inheritance, and explain death to me like he was explaining a business transaction. Matter of fact. Clinical. No warmth. No comfort. Just information delivered. And then we simply moved on. I cried for weeks. I cried at night when no one could hear me. I cried in school bathrooms between classes. I cried every time I saw something that reminded me of her, which was constantly because truly, everything reminded me of her. And Gerald's response to my grief? Impatience. He told me to pull myself together. He said that crying wouldn't bring her back and that I needed to start acting like a man, even though I was a 6-year-old boy who had just lost the only person who had ever made me feel safe. After that, it was just me and Gerald. A tiny 6-year-old boy and a man who treated parenting like dog breeding. Gerald was absolutely obsessed with legacy, with bloodlines, with good stock. He talked about family the way some people talk about racehorses. Genetics and breeding and potential. If I got AB on a report card, I was defective. If I didn't make varsity, I was a poor investment. If I showed any weakness, any vulnerability, any normal childhood emotion, he looked at me like I was a product that had arrived damaged from the factory. I learned early to hide my feelings around him. I learned to perform competence whether I actually felt it or not. I learned that love in our house was always conditional, and that those conditions were never clearly stated, but always ruthlessly enforced. But the real, irreparable fracture in our relationship didn't happen until I was 24. That's when my grandfather died, and the true nature of my father came into focus like a photograph developing slowly in a dark room. My grandfather, on my father's side, was a steel magnate. Old money, the kind of wealth that builds libraries and names hospital wings. He was a complicated man, with a heavy conscience about how that wealth had been accumulated. And he spent his later years trying to do some genuine good with it. Philanthropy, charitable trusts, anonymous donations to causes he deeply believed in. He was also the only source of real warmth in my entire childhood. When Gerald was cold and distant, grandfather was the one who took me fishing. When Gerald criticized absolutely everything I did, grandfather was the one who told me he was proud of me. When Gerald made me feel like an utter disappointment, grandfather made me feel like I truly mattered. Before he died, grandfather set up what's called a generation-skipping trust. It's a legal structure specifically designed to pass wealth directly to grandchildren, completely bypassing the middle generation. Partly it's for tax purposes, avoiding estate taxes. But partly I strongly believe grandfather did it because he knew exactly who his son was. He knew Gerald would burn through any money that came to him and leave absolutely nothing for the future. The trust was substantial, multiple millions, and it was designated specifically for me. Gerald was absolutely furious when he found out. Livid, he had spent his entire adult life waiting for his father to die so he could finally inherit the family fortune. He had structured his own finances around that firm expectation. He had made promises to people based on money he assumed would be his. And then the old man had the sheer audacity to skip right over him and hand everything directly to his grandson. I was 24, fresh out of grad school, and still grieving the profound loss of the only person in my family who had ever made me feel loved. A week after the funeral, Gerald summoned me to his study. The room smelled of old leather and expensive furniture polish. It was dark, lined with books that I'm not sure Gerald had ever actually read. They were there for show, like everything else in that cold house. He was sitting behind his massive desk, not even looking at me when I entered, shuffling papers like I was just an appointment he was squeezing in between more important matters. "We need to talk about the trust," he said flatly. "What about it?" I asked, confused. "You aren't going to accept it," he stated, like a fact, not a question. "You're going to sign a disclaimer of interest, passing the funds back to the general estate, to me." I remember standing there, genuinely confused. Why would I do that? Grandpa wanted me to have it. He set it up specifically for me. Gerald looked up from his desk then. He stood up slowly, and I was instantly reminded of how physically imposing he could be. He was a tall man, with hard eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. He moved around the desk and looked down at me with an expression I can only describe as contempt mixed with cold calculation. "Because if you don't," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, "I will destroy your mother's memory." He walked back to his desk and slid a manila folder across the polished wood towards me. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs. Grainy, clearly taken with a long lens, dated from the year before I was born. My mother with another man, embracing, kissing. The images were intimate and damning. "She was unfaithful, Ethan." Gerald's voice was cold, clinical. "I've known for years. You aren't my biological son. You're the offspring of her tennis instructor. I raised you out of charity, out of respect for the vows I made, even though she broke hers. But I will be damned if I let my father's money go to a stranger's blood." I felt the air leave the room. My lungs stopped working. My heart stopped beating. Everything stopped except for the ringing in my ears and the photographs swimming in front of my eyes. "You're lying," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Try me." Gerald's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "If you claim that trust, I will file a lawsuit contesting paternity. I will drag her name through the mud in every tabloid in New England. Everyone will know she was unfaithful. Every person who remembers her, every friend she had, every colleague, everyone will know exactly what kind of woman she really was. Is that what you want? To protect your bank account at the cost of her dignity?" I was young. I was heartbroken. I worshipped the memory of my mother because she was truly the only parent who had ever shown me genuine love. The thought of her being publicly shamed, even posthumously, made me physically ill. I could taste bile in the back of my throat. I looked at this man who had raised me with nothing but cold indifference for 18 years, and I realized something in that moment. He didn't care about me. He had never cared about me. I was a mere line item in his budget, an obligation he had fulfilled with minimal investment. The only thing he cared about was the ledger, the money. "Fine," I said, my voice shaking. "Keep the money. I don't want it. I don't want anything from you ever again." But Gerald wasn't satisfied with a mere handshake agreement. He wanted legal armor. He wanted documentation. He wanted to make absolutely sure I could never change my mind and come back for what was rightfully mine. His lawyers drew up a document, an affidavit, a sworn statement signed by Gerald under penalty of perjury, declaring that he had reason to believe I was not his biological issue. The document explicitly stated that for purposes of the estate and all future legal relations, our familial bond was hereby severed. In exchange for me signing a disclaimer on the trust, he agreed not to sue the estate for fraud regarding my mother's alleged infidelity. I signed the papers. Every single one of them. I signed away millions of dollars and my legal connection to the only family I had left. Then I packed a single bag, got in my car, and drove away from Darien, Connecticut that very same night. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't say goodbye. I just left. I moved to Boston with almost nothing. I had my grad school degree and a small amount of savings, and absolutely zero family support. The first few months were brutal. I scrubbed toilets in office buildings at night. I worked the early morning shift at a coffee shop before classes. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches and whatever I could get on sale at the discount grocery store. There were nights I sat alone in my tiny apartment, a studio barely big enough for a bed and a desk, and wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. I could have fought. I could have challenged the affidavit. I could have dragged Gerald into court and exposed his lies, and maybe gotten my inheritance back. But every time I considered it, I thought about years of litigation. I thought about depositions and discovery and expert witnesses. I thought about seeing Gerald's face across a courtroom, hearing his voice, having to speak to him and about him, and be constantly reminded of everything he had taken from me. I thought about the crushing toll it would take on my mental health, on my ability to focus on my work, on my chance to build something entirely new. So I kept moving forward. One day at a time. One shift at a time. One exam at a time. I built a career in genomics through sheer stubbornness. I was good at the work and I was willing to put in hours that other people weren't. I stayed late in the lab when everyone else went home. I read papers on weekends. I published research that got noticed by people who truly mattered. Slowly, incrementally, my life started to take genuine shape. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and disappointments and moments when I truly wanted to give up. But I didn't have the option of giving up. I had burned my bridges with Gerald, and there was no safety net waiting to catch me if I fell. Success was the only path forward, so I walked it. I met my wife, Rachel, at a conference about 3 years after I left Connecticut. She was presenting research on gene expression and she was brilliant and funny and she even laughed at my terrible jokes. Our first date was coffee that turned into dinner that turned into talking until 2 a.m. She didn't come from money. She didn't care about pedigrees or bloodlines or any of the things Gerald had spent his entire life obsessing over. She just cared about who I was as a person. We got married 2 years later in a small ceremony with friends from work. No family on my side. I had briefly considered inviting my grandfather's old friends, people who had known me as a child, but I decided against it. That chapter was completely closed. I was building something new. I created a life that was rich in ways Gerald could never, ever understand. But doubts are like weeds. They grow even in the dark. Even when you think you've pulled them all out. About a year after I left Connecticut, I bought a commercial DNA testing kit. Not for the ancestry results or the health information. I bought it because I needed to know the truth. I needed to know if Gerald had been telling the truth about my mother, or if he had simply manufactured the most devastating lie he could think of to manipulate me into giving up my inheritance. I spat in the tube. I mailed it off. I waited. When the results came back 3 weeks later, I sat alone in my tiny Boston apartment and opened the email with shaking hands. The DNA matched me with a first cousin on Gerald's side of the family. The genetic markers were undeniable. The science was clear. Gerald was my biological father. He had lied. He had lied about my mother's faithfulness, lied about my conception, lied to the lawyers, lied to me. He had fabricated an elaborate deception and used my profound love for my dead mother as a weapon against me. All to steal an inheritance that was legally and rightfully mine. I stared at that computer screen for hours. I went through every emotion you can possibly imagine. Rage, grief, vindication, despair. The urge to fly back to Connecticut and confront him was almost overwhelming. But then I realized something crucial. Going back would mean lawyers. It would mean court battles. It would mean seeing his face and hearing his voice and, worst of all, letting him back into my life. The money would connect me to him again. And that connection was a chain I had just spent a year filing through. I didn't want the money. I wanted the silence. So I printed out the DNA results and carefully put them in a safe deposit box. I closed the lid, turned the key, and walked away. I let Gerald keep his stolen millions. I figured he would die alone on a pile of gold, surrounded by expensive things and devoid of anyone who actually cared about him. That seemed like punishment enough. What I didn't account for was him losing everything. Apparently, Gerald's genius for business was mostly luck and inheritance. Without his father's guidance and resources, he was just another mediocre investor with expensive tastes and consistently poor judgment. Over the decade after I left, he poured the trust money into speculative tech startups that imploded spectacularly. He made leveraged bets on real estate developments that went bankrupt when the market shifted. He invested in ventures based solely on connections and hunches and country club recommendations, rather than actual due diligence. The thing about old money is that it creates an illusion of competence. When you're born wealthy, people just assume you must be smart. They invite you into deals. They trust your judgment. They give you opportunities that other people have to fight for. Gerald had spent his whole life coasting on that assumption. He thought he was a financial genius because his investments had always worked out. But his investments had always worked out because he was investing his father's money, using his father's connections within his father's network. Once that was all gone, once he had chased away everyone who actually knew what they were doing and surrounded himself with sycophants who told him exactly what he wanted to hear, the results were entirely predictable. I heard rumors over the years, whispers from old Connecticut contacts who reached out occasionally to gossip. Gerald had sold the Darien house. Gerald had moved to a smaller place. Gerald had stopped showing up at the club events. Gerald had been seen at restaurants he never would have set foot in before, eating meals he never would have ordered. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard these things. I didn't feel vindication. Mostly I felt nothing. He was a stranger. His problems were entirely his problems. I had my own life to live. Now, at 72, Gerald was completely broke. His health was rapidly failing. The man who had spent his entire life obsessed with wealth and legacy had neither. He was facing the very real prospect of public assistance, government programs, the kind of safety net he had always looked down on with utter contempt. And then someone, probably one of his lawyers, told him about filial responsibility laws. Most people don't even know these laws exist. I certainly didn't until I got served with that lawsuit. But in Connecticut, like in about 30 other states, there are statutes on the books that can actually require adult children to pay for the support of indigent parents. The laws are old, dating back to Elizabethan poor laws from centuries ago, and they're rarely enforced in modern times. Most people have never heard of them. Most lawyers have never filed a case under them. But they're still there, sitting in the legal code, waiting to be weaponized by someone desperate enough to try. Gerald was desperate. And there I was, his biological son, now a successful biotech executive with a nice salary, a house in the suburbs, and a life that looked from the outside like it could easily absorb a monthly payment of $3,500. He was playing the biology card after spending a lifetime denying it. The audacity of it all truly took my breath away. The sheer, shameless gall of this man claiming fatherhood when it was profitable, after legally declaring I wasn't his son when that was profitable. It was almost impressive in its depravity. I hired a lawyer. Her name was Meredith, a sharp woman who specialized in complex family litigation. She had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court, the kind of lawyer other lawyers warned their clients about. Her office was downtown, all glass and steel and expensive artwork. But she dressed like she was ready for a street fight. No-nonsense suits, practical shoes, the kind of woman who looked like she enjoyed winning far more than she enjoyed getting paid. When I sat down in her office and told her the whole story from the very beginning, she didn't frown. She didn't express sympathy or outrage or any of the emotions a normal person might show when hearing about a father who blackmailed his own son out of millions of dollars. She smiled. It was the kind of smile you might see on a shark right before it bites. The kind of smile that made you very, very glad she was on your side. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," she said, tapping her pen against her legal pad. "He's suing you based on biological paternity?" "Yes." "He claims that since you're his son, Connecticut law requires you to support him now that he's indigent?" "Exactly." "And you have the DNA test proving you are his biological son?" "I do." I paused. "But I also have this." I slid a photocopy across her desk. It was the 10-year-old affidavit. The document where Gerald had sworn under penalty of perjury that I was not his biological issue. The document he had used to steal my inheritance and sever our legal relationship. Meredith picked it up. She read it slowly, her eyes moving across each line like she was savoring a fine meal. When she finished, she read it again. Her smile widened with each paragraph until she looked like the cat that had eaten the canary and was already planning what to eat next. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said when she finally set it down. "This is absolutely beautiful. Your father has committed litigation suicide and doesn't even know it yet. Can we win?" I asked, a tremor in my voice. Meredith looked me dead in the eye. Her expression was pure, unwavering confidence. "Ethan, we aren't just going to win. We're going to make case law. They're going to teach this case in law schools." The court date was set for a gray Tuesday in November. The kind of day where the sky looks like concrete and the air bites at your face when you walk from the parking lot to the courthouse. The trees were bare, dead leaves scattered across the sidewalk. Everything looked cold and final. I wore my best suit, navy blue, well-fitted, the kind of suit you wear when you want to project success without being flashy about it. I felt calm in a way I hadn't expected. For 10 years, I had carried the weight of what Gerald had done to me, dragging it behind me like a chain attached to my ankle. Now I was about to set it down. I hadn't seen Gerald in a decade, and when he was wheeled into the courtroom, I almost didn't recognize him. He was withered, shrunken. The broad shoulders I remembered had curved inward. His once commanding presence had diminished to something almost pitiable. He was in a wheelchair, pushed by a home health aide who looked like she would rather be absolutely anywhere else. But the arrogance was still there. I could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he held his chin up, even as his body failed him. The entitlement was etched into the deep lines around his mouth. He was wearing an expensive suit that was clearly from better times, hanging off his gaunt frame like a costume from a play he was no longer cast in. He looked like a king in exile, still expecting the throne while sitting in the gutter. Gerald didn't look at me when he entered. He looked straight at the judge, a stern man named Judge Morrison, who had a reputation for having zero patience for family dramatics. Morrison had been on the bench for 30 years and had clearly seen every variety of human dysfunction. His expression suggested he had already decided this was going to be a complete waste of his time. Gerald's lawyer stood first. His name was Prescott, a bottom feeder in an expensive suit who clearly specialized in whatever cases paid the bills. He had the look of a man who had stopped believing in his clients a long time ago, but still desperately needed to make his mortgage payments. Prescott launched into his opening argument with theatrical sincerity. He painted Gerald as a devoted father who had fallen on hard times through no fault of his own. A man who had sacrificed everything to raise his son, only to be abandoned in his hour of need by an ungrateful child who had achieved success and turned his back on the very man who made it all possible. "Your Honor," Prescott said, gesturing toward Gerald's wheelchair with practiced sympathy. "The statute is clear. The defendant has substantial financial means. His father is destitute and in failing health. The biological link between them is irrefutable. We have submitted a recent paternity test, ordered by my client, which confirms a 99.9% genetic match. All we are asking for is the statutory support required by Connecticut law. We are simply trying to keep an old man off the streets." It was a compelling narrative. If you knew absolutely nothing about our history, you might have felt genuinely sorry for the old man in the wheelchair. You might have wondered what kind of son would abandon his elderly father to poverty. Then it was Meredith's turn. She didn't use the podium. She stood right next to me, her hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that I knew was calculated for the judge's benefit. Everything Meredith did was calculated. That's what made her so incredibly effective. "Your Honor," Meredith said, her voice cool and clear, "we do not dispute the plaintiff's current financial status. We have reviewed his documentation, and we accept that he has, through his own poor decisions, rendered himself indigent. Nor do we dispute the accuracy of the DNA test he has submitted. The genetic science is clear." She paused. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "However, we move for immediate dismissal based on the doctrine of judicial estoppel." Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Explain, counselor." "Judicial estoppel," Meredith explained, "prevents a party from taking a position in a legal proceeding that is directly contrary to a position they successfully took in an earlier proceeding." Meredith turned to look directly at Gerald as she spoke. "Essentially, Your Honor, you cannot tell one court that the sky is blue in order to win a case, and then tell another court that the sky is green in order to win a different case. The law does not permit such fundamental inconsistency." She walked toward the bench and handed a document to the bailiff. 10 years ago," Meredith continued, her voice gaining an edge, "Gerald Ashford coerced my client into disclaiming a multi-million-dollar inheritance. He achieved this through a calculated campaign of emotional manipulation and legal maneuvering. Central to this scheme was an affidavit, sworn under oath and filed with the probate court, in which Gerald Ashford declared that Ethan Ashford was not his biological son." The courtroom went dead silent. I watched Gerald's face for the first time since he had entered. He looked at me. His eyes were wide. His mouth opened slightly. He clearly had not expected this. His lawyer looked confused and alarmed, frantically flipping through his own papers. Prescott had clearly not been told about the affidavit. Gerald had hired him to file a simple support petition, probably assuring him it would be straightforward. He had conveniently neglected to mention the inconvenient paperwork from a decade earlier. "This is Exhibit A," Meredith said, holding up the document. "An affidavit of non-paternity, signed by the plaintiff, dated June 14, 2014. In this document, Gerald Ashford states under oath, and I quote, 'I have irrefutable evidence that Ethan Ashford is not of my biological issue, and I hereby sever all familial recognition and legal connection to him.'" She let the words hang in the air. He used this sworn statement to secure sole control of his father's trust fund. He presented it to the probate court as evidence that my client had no claim to the inheritance. The court accepted his representation, and the trust was dispersed according to his wishes. Meredith turned back to face the judge. "So, Your Honor, we have a dilemma. Either Gerald Ashford committed perjury and fraud 10 years ago when he told the probate court that my client was not his son, or he is lying to this court today when he claims my client is his son. Cannot be both ways. The law does not permit him to be a father when it is profitable and a stranger when it is convenient. He made his choice a decade ago. He signed documents. He swore oaths. He cashed checks. He doesn't get to unring that bell just because the money ran out." Judge Morrison picked up the old affidavit. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up the new DNA test that Gerald had submitted. He looked back and forth between the two documents like a man comparing a receipt to a bill and finding the numbers simply didn't match. "Mr. Prescott," the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "did your client inform you of this prior affidavit?" Prescott's face had gone a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Gerald with an expression of dawning horror, like a man who had just realized he had stepped into quicksand. "No, Your Honor," Prescott said. "I was not informed of this document. I was not made aware of these prior proceedings. Mr. Ashford," Judge Morrison addressed my father directly, "did you sign this affidavit?" Gerald shifted in his wheelchair. He looked older than he had just minutes before. The arrogance was cracking, revealing something desperate and cornered underneath. I was upset at the time," Gerald said, his voice raspy, weak. "I had suspicions about my late wife. I believed things that turned out to be incorrect. The DNA evidence proves I was wrong. I am his father. That's what matters. He owes me." "You swore under oath." Judge Morrison's voice was sharp as a blade. "You used this document to enrich yourself at the expense of your son. You stood before the probate court and told them this man was not your child. And on the basis of that sworn statement, you received money that was rightfully his. You don't get to undo a legal severance just because the money ran out. But I'm his father." Gerald's voice rose, cracking with something that might have been desperation or might have been rage. "I raised him. I fed him. I put a roof over his head for 18 years. That has to count for something." "It counts for nothing," the judge's voice cut through the courtroom like a hammer. "Because you sold that right. You traded your fatherhood for a trust fund. You cannot now claim the relationship you explicitly, legally, and under oath renounced." Meredith stepped forward again. "Your Honor, I would also note that the plaintiff has just admitted on the record that he is, in fact, the biological father of my client. This is an admission that his 2014 affidavit was false. He has essentially confessed in open court to committing fraud against the estate of his late father and perjury in the prior probate proceeding." She paused to let that sink in. While the statute of limitations for the original fraud may have passed, his submission of this current lawsuit constitutes a frivolous abuse of the court system. He is attempting to use the courts to perpetuate the same scheme he began a decade ago, simply inverting the lie to suit his current financial needs. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. He looked at Gerald with an expression of pure, undisguised contempt. The kind of look you might give something you found stuck on the bottom of your shoe. "The petition for filial support is dismissed with prejudice," the judge ruled. "Mr. Ashford, you are legally estopped from claiming paternity for the purpose of financial benefit, having previously denied that same paternity for the same purpose. In the eyes of this court, based on your own sworn statement from 2014, you have no son." The gavel came down. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison added, leaning forward over the bench, "I am sanctioning the plaintiff to pay all legal fees incurred by the defendant in responding to this frivolous action. And Mr. Prescott, I suggest you get your client out of my courtroom before I decide to refer this affidavit to the district attorney for a review of potential perjury charges. I don't care how old or sick he is. Fraud is fraud." I stood up. My legs felt strange, like they belonged to someone else entirely. Meredith shook my hand and said something about calling her office to handle the fee recovery, but I barely heard her. I walked toward the exit without looking back at Gerald. I could hear him behind me, his voice rising in a panicked, desperate cadence as he shouted at his lawyer. He was demanding to know how this had happened, insisting there must be something they could do, threatening to file appeals and complaints and lawsuits against everyone involved. But it all sounded distant, muffled, like noise from a television playing in another room. I pushed through the courthouse doors and walked out into the gray November afternoon. The cold air hit my face and I breathed it in deeply. It tasted like freedom. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "Ethan, I know you have money. You can't let me starve. I'm your flesh and blood." I looked at the message for a long moment. I felt a familiar twinge somewhere in my chest. The old conditioned response. The trained need to please him, to prove my worth, to earn the approval he had never given freely. But then I thought about the affidavit. I thought about the lies he had told about my mother. I thought about the photos he had used to blackmail me. The accusations of infidelity that the DNA had proven false. I thought about 10 years of silence while he spent money that should have been mine. Never once reaching out, never once checking to see if I was alive or dead. I typed my reply slowly. "Per your 2014 affidavit, I'm the son of a tennis instructor. You should ask him for money." I hit send. Then I blocked the number. The story didn't end quietly. It couldn't because Gerald hadn't just sued me. He had exposed himself. Court transcripts are public record in Connecticut. Within a week, the humiliating details of the hearing were circulating through the tight-knit, gossipy world of New England old money. The country club set, the people Gerald had spent his whole life trying to impress, learned that he had committed fraud against his own father's estate to disinherit his son. They learned that he had signed documents swearing I wasn't his child, then turned around and demanded money from me because I was. People in those circles talk. They gossip over golf games and dinner parties and charity events. Within a month, everyone who mattered in Gerald's world knew exactly what he had done. The word fraud spreads through high society like wildfire. Nobody wants to be associated with a fraud. His remaining friends quickly abandoned him. The country club he had belonged to for 40 years revoked his membership. 2 weeks after the trial, his last investment partner filed a lawsuit, accusing him of misrepresenting assets in a deal from 6 years earlier. The lawsuit named specific instances where Gerald had inflated numbers to secure funding. It was a civil case, but the discovery process unearthed emails that got forwarded to the state attorney general's office. Gerald ended up in a state-run care facility. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, meals on plastic trays, the kind of place funded by the very same taxpayer programs he had spent his whole life voting against. 3 months after the trial, I got a call from Meredith. The fee sanctions had been processed. Gerald's remaining assets, a small investment account he had tried to hide, had been liquidated to cover my legal costs. The check was already in the mail. Payable, $22,000. It wasn't the millions he had stolen from me, but it covered what I had spent defending myself against his nonsense, plus a little extra. I donated the extra to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. Kids trying to make something of themselves without family money backing them up. It felt appropriate. A few months later, a package arrived at my house from a lawyer handling Gerald's affairs. The facility had limited storage, and Gerald had been forced to surrender most of his personal effects. Someone had decided to send a box of items to me. Most of it was junk, old papers, random trinkets. But at the bottom of the box was a photo album. I opened it. The album was full of pictures of me learning to ride a bike, me at graduation, me winning a science fair. For about 10 seconds I wondered if maybe he had cared after all. Then I turned one of the photos over. It was a picture of me at 10 years old, holding a first-place trophy. On the back, in Gerald's familiar handwriting, investment cost to date, $42,000. ROI pending. I flipped through more photos. Same thing. Dollar amounts. Cost calculations. Performance notes. He hadn't kept them because he loved me. He kept them as receipts. I took the album to the fireplace that night. I built a fire, fed the photos in one by one, and watched them burn. 6 months after that, I got a promotion at work, head of my department. The announcement went out in the company newsletter and got picked up by a few industry publications. My name was in the news for the right reasons. A week later, a letter arrived. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Gerald had somehow gotten access to a pen and paper. The letter was 3 pages of rambling accusations. I had stolen his legacy. I had turned everyone against him. I had abandoned him when he needed me most. He demanded that I visit him. He demanded that I apologize. He demanded that I acknowledge everything he had sacrificed to raise me. At the bottom he had written, "You owe me. You will always owe me. I made you." I read the whole thing. Then I walked to my home office, pulled out the DNA results I had kept in my files for over a decade, and made 3 copies. I mailed one to the lawyer who had sent me the box of Gerald's things, with a note explaining what it was and suggesting it be added to any official records. I mailed one to the district attorney's office that had received the referral from Judge Morrison, in case they ever decided to pursue the perjury angle. The 3rd copy I kept. Then I took Gerald's letter, folded it neatly, and mailed it back to him with a single post-it note attached. The post-it said, "Per your 2014 affidavit, I'm not your son. Please direct all future correspondence to the tennis instructor." I never heard from him again. What do you think of this whole situation? Have you ever had to draw a really firm line with family, even when it felt impossible? Tell me what you think, I really want to know.